And away we go. It's good to see you all. Thank you very much for coming to this session on a Friday afternoon. Your friend of mine, Martin Fortley of Birmingham, sent me a Twitter message last week, I think, about teaching class 9Z on a Friday afternoon. And I can sort of imagine what he imagined this class was like. But you look much more intelligent and with it than class 9Z on a Friday afternoon, so we'll look forward to it. The other thing is we're all wearing these lanyards with the Musicians' Union on it, which is great, and the Musicians' Union, which I talk to quite often, a great organisation, and I feel like we should sing that fantastic 70s Straub song, The Part of the Union, about striking for higher pay and defeating the government plan and all that. It's a magnificent song, because it ages me that I remember this song. Some of you won't know the song. But actually, as I've lamented before to one or two people sitting in this room, I work for an organisation that if I take industrial action, then our customers are really quite pleased that we're out. They seem to be more than happy to do without the service we provide. So there's going to be no pay rise for me this year. That's quite clear. Now, moving on then, we've got a lot to get through this afternoon. Actually, by the end of the session, I'm hoping that we'll be talking to each other, and we may even be as revolutionaries to move chairs around a bit towards the end, but we'll see how well we do, so that we can talk to each other about some of these things. And as you see from the title of the presentation, it's your call. And really, that's the key message, particularly if you're working in a school. And really, my words this afternoon are mainly addressed to people who are actually teaching music or leading music in schools, and obviously those who support them. So I'm going to just start by reiterating really some things that if you've heard me speak before, you will have heard me say before. From Ofsted's findings about music over the years. And then I'm going to be moving into some new areas, trying to help us to move this thinking on and what it all might mean. So just to remind you really that when we published the report, What Hubs Must Do, a year and a bit ago now, we had this coffee to smell, which is that, the teaching of music in many schools is not as good as we would want it to be. And generally speaking, the cause of that is the leadership within the school. It's usually the senior leadership team who don't really understand what music might achieve for the school or what it's for, who tend to make it difficult for music teachers, whether they're generalist teachers or specialist teachers, to do the very best job they can. We also have a significant problem, which was talked about in a session earlier today about GCSE and A-level reform, that the take-up of music at Key Stage 4 and 5 is really very low. And that's sad for all sorts of reasons, and that's part of the problem that kind of exists, or the point that we get to. And so the point of that report that we published just over a year ago was to try to galvanise the resources that exist within schools, because most funding nationally for formal music education resides in schools. Hubs have some, but most of it's there in schools, so that was our job. And here's just a quick reminder of some of those reasons why music isn't going as well nationally as we would all like it to be. One of the problems is that music lessons, and I'm sure this doesn't apply to people who are here, Henry Van, is Henry here? Where's Henry? Is he here? Oh, maybe he's in a meeting with someone else. He's got more important things to do. But Henry, I think, said in one of his sessions yesterday from ISM that the elephant in the room is the people who are not in the room. The fact is we've got so many people we're still trying to reach, and people who are here today, understand this. So we're trying to reach, more people in schools who need our help. So these are the problems, generally speaking, that we find with the leadership of music in schools. And these apply, by the way, to all sorts of school, primary, secondary, special. They're all, the problems are often common. And it is that senior school leaders, and this isn't their fault, but often they're not sure what it is that music is for in a school and what could be achieved through it. They often think, I often have this discussion with them, and so do my colleagues. They often think that music is really about the kids having a chance to do a performance of some kind or to enjoy something which is different from other subjects. And of course, those things are true and may be true, but there's a lot more to what, as we know, to what music is about than just that. Assessment systems, which I'm going to say a little bit more about in a while, get in the way, and you know that much better than I do, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And it is very sad, actually, that music subject leaders, primary and secondary, often find themselves very isolated. And what that means is that even people who really do know what they're doing and who are potentially very good music teachers and understand what it's about, because they're isolated and not well supported by their leaders, end up not teaching as well as they could. And I've seen that many times. You know, people who actually are good people, who know their stuff, whose actual performance in the classroom, if you like, is not what it could be because they haven't got the help that they need. So we've really got a lot to do. And the truth of the matter is that reform in education really does need to come from schools themselves. You know, it's the most powerful form of reform. That's not to say that other people can't help, certainly can, but it's the schools themselves that need to lead that reform. And so that's why I'm saying I'm addressing what I'm saying today very much to people who work in schools. And this is really the nub of it, and that's why I'm saying it's your call. If you're working in a school, you're going to be making decisions, important decisions, and you should be making these decisions about what you're going to teach in music and how you're going to teach it. And it's your call. It's not for me to tell you or for anybody else to tell you. It's your call. And that's why what this session is called. Let's just remind ourselves, just to depress ourselves a little bit, of just one or two more of the things that the What Hubs Must Do survey found last year. By the way, we found this in this relatively small number of schools that we specifically visited for that survey, 31 of them, but of course it was the same as we had found in hundreds of other schools that we'd visited for other surveys beforehand. So it was very much the same messages that we already knew. And very often the curriculum in the schools was not very good. It didn't have much depth, it didn't have much rigour about it. And very often you had a music hub sitting there, because we were looking at hubs, who actually had quite a lot to offer. Had people within the hub who knew quite a lot about this, but were finding it difficult to get into the schools to share that expertise. And the schools didn't realise that that service was available to them. And sometimes the hubs didn't realise that, you know, they needed to be a bit more forceful, if you like, in getting in there and doing it. Hubs found it, as you can see there in the second bullet point, hard to get noticed, especially by senior leaders. In fact, Patrick, who may be here, is at the back there, was saying exactly this point. And one of the challenges for hubs is not to take no for an answer. And some of our hubs, in fact, a lot of our hubs are getting very good at this now, actually, and that's something we'll celebrate later on. Not to take no for an answer, to keep persistent and make the offer so good that nobody in the end is going to resist it too easily. So moving on further, we did find at the time of the survey, which is now over a year ago, that sometimes hubs were providing services to schools. They were selling them stuff, whether it was instrumental teaching or whatever else it was, but they didn't actually ask the school why they wanted this service or whether it could be used better or improved in some way. And first access teaching, and there may well be people in here who deliver first access teaching, usually in primary schools, very often was something rather separate from everything else the school was doing. In the worst cases, and by the way, this worst case scenario is common, the head teacher was really quite pleased that somebody was teaching ocarinas or whatever it was, and as far as they were concerned, that was music sorted, because they had 10 weeks of guitar teaching for class 3, year 3, that was it. You know, they had music in the school. Now that's terrible, isn't it? That's absolutely a terrible scenario, and it still exists now, but it's becoming rarer. So at the back in December, when I had the privilege of speaking at the Westminster Educational Forum, I made it very clear then that a year on from the report, that I wanted to pay a lot of tribute to the work that hubs have done. I think hubs have really done a superb job, actually, in the last now year and a bit, and I want to reiterate that today. Because all of that I've just described, although it all does still exist, you know, everything I've said so far is still out there, there's change going on. And I can see this, and colleagues in this room will know that it's changing. Hubs have developed their work really very well. And it's magnificent, really, to see, and rather humbling, actually, to see what all those colleagues working in so many hubs have done to develop their role and to support teachers who are doing the hard job at the chalk face in school. The report, actually, although it was critical of hubs, was actually a considerable vote of confidence in the hubs. And I'm really pleased to say that that vote of confidence has been proved to be correct. And if you just look at this, you will see some of the things that hubs are doing now that wasn't quite as good a year ago. So every hub now has a SMEP, a school music education plan, which is guiding their work. There's been much better discourse, and of course there has been some more funding as well. Whole change really in the way that hubs think and the way that they discuss things, and actually to some extent the confidence they have to get in there and not take no for an answer, to have that challenging and supportive conversation with the schools in their area. And I must also pay tribute, and I don't think they're here, to the Arts Council, who, much maligned as they sometimes are, actually have led this and have done rather well, I think, to support hubs in this particular important work. So just a quick reminder now of what hubs' role is, really, in schools particularly. Hubs have lots of roles. These are not all of their roles, but what their role is when they're working with and serving schools. And these are the things that I'd like to identify, really, that are listed on the screen there. So I'm not going to go through those things with you because I want to get on to some different stuff. But you know, this is what we see hubs doing. And as I say, hubs are doing this well. Hubs have come a long way in the way that they do this, and there's still plenty more to do, as you'll all know, but we have come a very long way. And the challenge for hubs, and this is where you in schools work with your hub to support them, is to show that improvement where they are supporting self-managing schools, academies, all kinds of schools, free schools on the ground. Now, if you work in a hub, you will know that at the moment peer review is all the rage, and that, in a sense, is the way this is going to be tested, by hubs peer reviewing each other. You know, to what extent are hubs, when they supportively review each other, managing to achieve those objectives that I've just talked about. So, well done, the hubs, and this is where it's moving forward. That's the way that hubs will show, and I believe they will be able to do this. I've got a lot of confidence in this. I believe that hubs are going to be able to point to a lot of success in this work that they're doing, albeit with plenty more to do. Here's a silly picture, which I also showed actually back in December. That's a very silly picture. But the reason I'm showing this very silly picture, which actually was taken at a conference of a music hub back in last summer, I think, with me holding a cabassa. The reason I had a cabassa in my hand, which you can see there, is because on Pointless, that programme on with wherever it is on BBC One, that was a pointless answer. They showed a picture of a cabassa and it was pointless. Well, I knew it was a cabassa, so I thought, well, that's good. That's one thing I know. That's very good. So I thought I'd better show solidarity with the cabassa community by playing one there. But the reason why I am showing this is because, as a sector, our work together should be really full of joy. You know, sharing music with young people and helping them to develop their understanding, appreciation, skills, whatever, in music is one of the most enjoyable things that there is. So much as we have problems to overcome, and we certainly do, it's a joyful thing. And while we're on that point, I want to reiterate a point that I heard made in one of the sessions earlier that is important. In my experience, the music education sector, that's the whole range of organisations that work in music education, has come together much more in the last year or two. And there is less of this sort of competition between different organisations. I described this about a year ago as the big tent. You know, I said we need a big tent, and actually some people laughed at me using that phrase. I said we need a big tent of organisations that's going to support hubs, who in turn support the schools. And actually that has largely happened. You know, there has been this sort of change of atmosphere within the sector, which has been very welcome, and which others have also noticed and have mentioned during this conference. So I'm giving an upbeat message today. Despite all the problems we've got, there's a lot good that's happening, and you know, we need to keep the momentum going. It's a great endeavour. It's a wonderful thing to be involved with, even though the poor cabassa definitely needs more support. So when you devise your music curriculum, make sure there's a high profile for this much neglected instrument, won't you? Because it's a magnificent thing. So moving on now to a bit more about context. Now, is John Finney in the room? He was here earlier. Is John here? He's not here. Well, I did ask his permission to use his blog. John's written a very interesting blog, I thought, and it was published very recently, and you may have seen this, and the web address of it is there. But I think that John made some very important points in this blog, which I just wanted to share with you because they get to the nub of some of those problems that I was talking about earlier on. Now, when I began teaching, which makes me sound like old father time, because I started teaching before the national curriculum existed, a long time before there were levels, sub-levels and everything else. And when I first started teaching, back in the 1980s it was, before the national curriculum, I was absolutely accountable. You know, I had to make sure that I taught the kids, they made progress, that I managed the class, that the kids enjoyed it, all of that. You know, that was, I absolutely was accountable for those things. But what I didn't have was this extraordinary sort of tick list thing where I had to prove all these levels and sub-levels and all the rest of it that's going on now. I was accountable in the sense of responsible, like John puts here. That was my experience at that time. Now, you know and I know that in the 1980s, education wasn't in a perfect place. It did lack rigour at times, because actually, you know, you could avoid, in a weaker school particularly, that accountability. So it wasn't that everything was right then by any means. But nevertheless, as a teacher, you did have a certain amount of sort of reasonable autonomy. And you made decisions for yourself, and you were then accountable for the outcomes of those decisions within the structures of the school. So John's point is quite right here, I think, and I've seen this many times about the teacher not having much of a voice, really, and being subject to some quite severe restrictions, really, because of this culture. That actually was mentioned in the last session as well. And then John goes on to say, well, what can be done about this, beyond just expressing sympathy for it? Well, the first one, I think, is really important, and I suppose that's part of what I'm trying to do today, but others are doing it too in this conference, is to help music teachers to actually feel confident and feel capable of being able to speak for themselves about what they're trying to achieve. As I say, it's your call. You are in charge of music in your school. You will decide, and you should decide, what happens in the music in your school. Doesn't mean you don't listen to other people and get guidance and help from other people, of course, like your hub or anybody else. But you are responsible for it, and that's where you should be. And then he goes on to look at things like case studies and researching this problem. I mean, I would love to do some case studies about this from Ofsted. I think it'd be very useful. Whether it will happen, I don't know, because Ofsted, like everybody else, is very short of money at the moment, and you know, so things like this are not the highest priority. But it would be great, you know, in terms of that, not because it's not valued, it's just because there isn't the you know, there isn't the resource to do a lot of this kind of good practice or survey type work. But John is quite right again, in my view. So we've got to grow confidence and share these thoughts together so that we can build up from here. So the outworking of that, the outworking of those points that John is making, and this is where we go back to the Hub's report again. We very often found, for the research for that survey and previous surveys, that the curriculum in schools was quite shallow in music. And very often, particularly in Key Stage 3, but often actually in Key Stage 2 as well, less so in Key Stage 1, you would have 6 weeks on hip-hop, 6 weeks on the blues, 6 weeks on something else, 6 weeks on world music, which is a term I've never really, I don't actually know what world music is. I actually don't know. If someone would like to tell me what it is, I'll be grateful to hear. What is world music? Right, you see? It was a category invented by the record industry to put music they didn't know where to categorise somewhere else. And yet, if you're lucky in Key Stage 3, you get 6 weeks on that. And if there's a bank holiday, 5 weeks. So that's how world music is covered. So often we see that. Now, to be quite honest with you, sometimes that sort of curriculum, which is common, is rather shallow. Because it really does flip-flop around from, you know, a bit of 12-bar blues to a bit of this and a bit of the other. But what it doesn't do is build up in depth. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be telling or getting students to hear some hip-hop or some rap or some blues or some jazz or whatever else. Of course we should. Great for them to hear these different styles of music. But actually, it's the music that matters. And John Finney, who isn't in the session, said a very profound, I think, and a very important thing earlier on, that the value of music education is in music education. It's in the musical learning that goes on, and so there's got to be a deep curriculum. Now, there are many side benefits, as he quite rightly said, of learning about music, teamwork and all that sort of thing, which is great, and nothing wrong with any of it, it's marvellous. But actually that isn't what justifies it. What justifies it is learning in depth about music. And so we've got to make sure that the curriculum that we develop has that depth. Personal view, and this is only a personal view, I would rather just study the music and then bring the genres in as a kind of supporting act and say this is how, this is how it looks in this genre and this is how it looks in this genre, but actually it's the music that counts. Because actually I don't see much difference, frankly, between Beethoven and the Beatles, as I've said before. They both use C major, G major scales, instruments, they do it in quite a different way, but there's an awful lot of commonality between them, and that will be true between all sorts of types of music. So it's the music that counts, in my view. 2011, Wider Still and Wider, written by my predecessor Mark Phillips, who many of you will know. Nearly all schools recognise the importance of promoting a diverse range of musical styles, but far fewer had an understanding about how all students should make good musical progress as they move through the curriculum 1 to 3. Now here's another interesting point that comes out of that, and this relates to this low take-up at GCSE. Just to be very clear, the music curriculum, Key Stages 1, 2 and 3, is not a preparation for GCSE. It's not. It stands in its own right and it has its own purpose. But if it's good, it will, as a byproduct of that, prepare students well for GCSE, and it will give them the confidence to take it on. Rather like the art curriculum does rather better, actually, at preparing students to take art. That's probably why, we think it's why, about 4 times as many students nationally take art GCSE as take music, because the art curriculum prepares students better for the art GCSE, and the students feel more confident in taking it. Now, this is a very complicated area. There's a lot to sort of think about that area, but so just to be very clear, Key Stage 3 and what goes before it is not a preparation for GCSE. It's not. But nevertheless, if it's done well, it will have that effect. It will give students the confidence to take. One of the things, of course, that puts students off taking GCSE is that they feel they haven't got the instrumental skills to perform. And if we could develop the singing culture in schools, then that problem would be largely solved. Because, of course, singing is a fine thing to do for GCSE. So, there's things to think about here too. So we said this, that the teaching in curricula as implemented blah, 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 blah. Schools want to make the curriculum relevant and accessible and enjoyable, and who's going to argue with that? But actually, far too often when you say to the students, do you like these music lessons? They say, no, we don't. They're boring, they're dull, they're not exciting. That's not true in all schools. It's probably not true in any of the schools that are represented here. But there's a job to do out there with many schools which need to develop this curriculum for the reasons I've explained. Now I'm going to divert off into another area that we covered off. I'm taking a little digression at this point to talk about classical music, because we had a problem when this report was published, because we said this: classical music as a serious component of the curriculum was treated as a step too far in most of the primary and secondary schools surveyed, at least until Key Stage 4, because teachers thought that classical music was too difficult or inaccessible for pupils. Now, I'm not happy with that philosophy. I'll make that very clear. Not because I think that classical music is more important or better than any other genre. I don't. Because personally, I like a lot of classical music, but I like a lot of other sorts of music as well, and I expect that's the same here in this room. What I'm not happy about is this view that somehow young people just won't like classical music because it was written 200 years ago and all that. They will like it. And Katie is here. Where's Katie? No, Katie is here. I know she's here. There she is. And if there's one thing that this magnificent BBC 10 Pieces project has taught us, which I knew it was as soon as Katie told me when this report was being published, we are thinking of doing this classical music project, will you back us in this? And I said, yes, I absolutely will, because I am convinced, absolutely convinced, because I've done it myself as a teacher, and so have many of you, that when classical music is well presented to young people, they will love it, absolutely love it, as they will love jazz and hip-hop and rap as well, but they will love classical music. And this is what 10 Pieces has taught us. Because if you were here earlier on this morning and you saw the response of so many thousands of these young people to classical music, it's there. So this is a challenge to us in the sector. We have thought that classical music sometimes isn't easy to teach, and it isn't actually. I'm not saying it is easy to teach, but it can be taught very well. It can be part of that you know, that set of genres that support the musical teaching that's going on. Now, I'm going to just bring in now, just to emphasise this, because when 10 Pieces was launched back in early October last year, it led to quite a lot of press interest, as well as interest across the BBC. And I'm just going to put up on the screen now a couple of bits of stuff that was written in the press at that time after 10 Pieces came out. I probably don't agree, actually, fully with any of these. These are not things that I personally would have written or put my name to, but nevertheless they make points that are interesting to us and which we need to hear, I think. So here's Nicola Benedetti, who's one of the 10 Pieces champions, who says, look, classical music is good for kids. So we teach them like we teach them how to do quadratic equations. Interesting perspective. Not everybody would agree with that. Some people say, well, we don't teach it because they don't like it, but there's a view. What's school for, she says. Victoria Mitchell, Corran, married to David Mitchell, isn't she, and on all these quiz shows. Really interesting article that she wrote in The Observer, actually just about the time that 10 Pieces was coming through. And this is what she said. She said that her school, she was thinking back to her own music education in school, and she said this. So actually, if I'm 30 or 40 or 50, I can still learn about guitars and drums. And by the way, I like guitars and drums. We'll make that very clear. So not against that at all. But because they're so predominant, anybody can pick that up at any time. But she's probably right. If you don't pick up the violin in childhood, you're unlikely to get the chance. Interesting point she makes. And then she goes on to say this. My primary school had a box of old recorders. That's what she says. But this box of recorders that they had an impact on her, because look what happened. She went on YouTube and found Vivaldi's Recorder Concerto in D. And she was amazed that Vivaldi had written a concerto for recorders. She just didn't know this happened. She found it in later life because her school had taught her something about the recorders. So this is people who are not music educators, but saying, actually, we want in our schools classical music to have a place. James Mayhew, who wrote the Katie books that you might know, particularly if you've got children who've learnt about these. Again, I wouldn't personally have written this. This wouldn't be my personal view, but it's a view that's out there that we need to know. And he says, you know, that he had a time when he listened to the old LPs played by a teacher. And he says when he visits schools, the CDs by the hi-fi, Disney songs, show tunes, easy listening. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, actually. You know, nothing wrong with any of those things, but it's a question of what's the balance. And it will be the case that if teachers are not confident, they won't take it further or take it into a different area than what they are used to. Then he quite rightly, in my view, goes on to say that he's not saying that classical music is better than other kinds, but also he says it's not inferior because it's old. And somebody did say in a session earlier on, I don't like us learning about dead composers. Well, I'm expecting to be dead in a few years' time, and we'll all be dead in a few years, I'm afraid. That's the nature of the world. Out there on those pianos earlier, I've heard some Beethoven piano sonatas being played this morning, and that music is absolutely not dead, even though Beethoven sadly is, because every time that music is played by somebody and interpreted by somebody, it's alive. So the music is very much alive, even if sadly the composer isn't still with us. And it doesn't make it inferior because it was written 200 or so years ago. And I agree with that. And here's an interesting one, and I certainly wouldn't have written this, but it does create an interest. This was a letter that came into the Observer in response to some of this stuff, which was, and he says here, the bottom of that article, this is a member of the public who was responding to an article called Classical Music is More Relevant to the Future. And he says, and I wouldn't have written this myself, but he says, I will keep because he's rather rude for one thing, but nevertheless he says, I will keep a copy of this piece to shove in the face of the next person who suggests I'm narrow-minded for not restricting myself to British and American commercial music produced in the last few decades. Now, I wouldn't say that, actually, that wouldn't be my personal view, but again, it's a view that's out there. We've got to be careful about this. You know, young people exist in a very commercial, a much more commercial time than even my generation did. And the music that they listen to is sold to them in a very heavy way. And we do have to be careful at teachers that we understand the commercial pressures that are under and to some extent mitigate those. So I wouldn't have actually written that point, but it is again something else that we need to be careful about when we're teaching music, or indeed any other subject actually. And Gary is here. Where's Gary? Now I'm going off piste here. Gary and I had a nice chat at lunchtime. And Gary said, I want to pick up one of your really good points this afternoon. He said, which one's that? He said, I don't think I've made any good points. And I said, well, I did have to look quite deep, Gary, to find a good point. But here it is. This is the one. Gary's here. Gary wrote a very good article in a very good book that he edited about all sorts of aspects of musical education. And this takes us in another direction that's important. Bearing in mind what we said earlier about world music, and every kind of music I've spoken to about so far, more or less, has been within the Western tradition, whether it's jazz, blues, whatever. There's a serious problem, isn't there, that because we are in the Western tradition, that we then, as it were, look down on other forms of music that don't come through the Western tradition. And I actually don't know what the answer to this is, actually. It's really difficult, not to then say, well, if we're going to look at all these different genres that are within the Western tradition somehow through the music, how do we do this? But what I do know is that a good teacher will make sure that students understand that music is music. And in the end, that's the key message, isn't it? Music is music. And I wanted to raise Gary's point here, not because I've got an answer to this, actually, but because it is very important that we don't allow the music curriculum to, as it were, treat non-Western forms of music as some kind of second-class citizen, which clearly they're not. So thank you for that, Gary. And actually, Gary has made many very good points, but this is one of them. And it's an important point that we shouldn't forget when we are designing the curriculum. All of which is very difficult in an hour a week, isn't it? But, you know, these are the issues that we've got to consider. So I'm going to move on now to some things that if you've heard me speak before, you will have heard me say before, and some that you won't. But these are important points. I published a blog last June, which is on the Ofsted Twitter blog. So it's an official Ofsted publication, this. And basically, the message is very clear, and I'm not apologising for saying this again, and some of you will have certainly heard me say this before, but I have to keep saying this because it's still a big problem. There's Ofsted's Twitter feed. Don't use sub-levels, and actually come to that, levels, in music assessment. Please don't do it. Now, earlier on, we were hearing about SLTs, and very often, particularly in Key Stage 3, the SLT will insist that these levels and sub-levels are used. And this is a battle that we have absolutely got to continue to take. Not because we want to prove those SLTs wrong or anything like that. It's not a battle in the sense of sort them out, but it is in the sense of getting this right for the young people. Because we cannot go on with this system where we have to try and measure an art subject as if it was some kind of rigid progression of skills, which it certainly isn't. So that was what I said, and I need to make this very clear once again in this blog. That is absolutely no kind of Ofsted requirement to have levels and sub-levels and this neat spreadsheet of progression through music. It absolutely isn't. And Martin, who was here yesterday, also was very kindly quoted various things that I said in that blog. And this blog still very much stands. And subsequently, Ofsted has produced its more official document telling schools in no uncertain terms that there is no expectation of any kind of assessment system in any school. Ofsted will just look at what you do without any preconception about what it should look like. And in music, and actually in many of the foundation subjects particularly, levels and sub-levels are not effective, and we don't want, and they're unlikely to be therefore constructive. I mean, if we go to a school and they're using them brilliantly, we'll say so, but we've never actually seen a school where that's the case, so it hasn't happened yet. So we remain open to that, but as yet we haven't come across that, where sub-levels and levels are working well in music. We've never seen it. It's always been a hindrance more than a help, always. So, you know, always open to seeing something different, but we haven't seen it yet. And also we say this about what happens in music lessons and what it looks like. There is no Ofsted view of what a good music lesson should look like. It is your call. And there are lots of ways of teaching a good music lesson. And that's really nice, actually. I've been privileged to see many of them. But nevertheless, what does characterize good music lessons is that the young people are making music. That's what characterises them. They spend the vast majority of that time actually making music. And very often, you know, as a teacher, you don't actually need to tell the kids what they're about to do. You just get on with it. And if you want to change something about it, you do it musically. You know, you can actually, particularly if you're working as a whole class, you know, and they're singing, for example, you don't need to tell them to sing differently. You just model it and just let it happen, and it happens without even stopping the flow of the music. That's what really, the sorts of things that really skilled teachers can do. It doesn't mean that a good teacher won't, of course, use some explanation and didactic teaching occasionally for the reasons I've said there, but fundamentally the lessons are musical. But there are lots and lots of ways of doing that. And we also know that all this business of going through learning objectives and Walton Wilf and whatever else we like to call it is terribly time consuming. Terribly time consuming. We don't have time for that. Get on with the music and the kids will learn best. We really don't have time for that. So just to summarise here what we're saying, and I'm saying this in very quick terms about assessment in music. The first of all thing, it does not need to be complicated at all. It doesn't have to relate to any numbers or letters. It should be formative so that it helps young people to know how they can improve their work. That's comments from you as the teacher, peer comments, their own reflections on it. Next, the assessment needs to be about music because it's a music lesson. So assessment in music is not about whether the young people work well together as a team or whether they listened well to the instructions. I mean, those might be good things to point out to them. You know, I'm not saying that that's not relevant, but that's not what musical assessment is about. It's about, are they making music that's right in terms of what they're trying to achieve? You know, how well are they doing that? Technology can be really useful in music assessment because it's so easy nowadays in a way that it wasn't in those 30 years ago I was talking about when I started. It was much harder then to sort of, well, you could record things then, of course, but it was so easy now to store and catalogue digitally recordings of students' music. And you don't need a big number of these recordings. You don't need to keep everything that they've done, but that's a very good way of storing and keeping assessments. And the thing that happens in Key Stage 3 with this predication on English and Maths from Fisher Family Trust, give it sort of 10% merit, but 90% of the time it's because in a sense it does help to keep expectations up, and that's a good thing. But you know, clearly what a young person does in Key Stage 2 SATs with English and Maths is not necessarily a proxy at all for what they might do at GCSE music. It's a very difficult thing to correlate, actually, and so you know that's another thing that we've got to sort of stand out against. Really, we need to assess people on music, not on anything else. So going back to wider still and wider, this is what we said then, and we'll still say this now. A well-ordered catalogue of recordings over time, supported by commentaries and scores, provides a very effective and compelling way to demonstrate students' progress. It doesn't need to have any levels or sub-levels or numbers attached to it. It can be purely a sort of description or assessment of how those students have moved forward. Just like it used to be. Now, so it's a good opportunity. Quick think piece now. Here's some reminders of what I've said so far. I'm not going to go through all this again, but in a sense that sums up some of the points that I've made in this discussion so far. So I won't go through all of those, but these are key things that we might like to bear in mind when we're devising a curriculum in school. We do need it to be better than it is. You know, there are improvements needed out there, but all these other things are things that we need to consider to achieve that. At this conference last year, I showed this slide for the first time, which you may well have seen before, but I want to just say a little bit more about this now. This actually is the Key Stage 3 one, but it applies equally to Key Stage 2, 1 or the early years. The blue line in the middle there is the curriculum that you are going to design, hopefully an innovative curriculum that you've made up for yourself, which includes formative assessment. And it's going towards that summative point at the end of the key stage, whether that's year 9, year 8, year 6, year 2, whatever. And you will decide, because it's your call, you will decide what that summative point is. What does this young person who comes into my school or my key stage need to be like when they get to that age or that summative point? And you are going to devise a curriculum that enables them to get there. And frankly, I don't mind a jot if what your curriculum like is different from your curriculum. It really doesn't matter to me. I don't want particularly a national view on this. I'm quite happy to go into school and judge it on its own terms, if you like. You know, one school may have a different view about what the 11-year-old musician looks like from another one, within reason. I mean, there's obviously good reasons for schools to talk to each other about this, particularly in local areas. But that doesn't mean they will all reach precisely the same conclusion. And that doesn't matter to me. What does matter is these kids do some music and get a good musical education. Actually, in your curriculum, you're not going to cover everything. You know, when you make decisions about what you're going to do, you'll also be making decisions about what you're not going to do. And different schools might take different views on that, and I don't mind that at all. It is your call. But what you do need to have is a high expectation for the point at which that young person reaches the end of the key stage. What does that 14, 11, 7, or indeed 5-year-old musician look like at that point? And therefore, what do we need to do with them, or what experiences do we need to offer them in the curriculum to get them to that, to help them, or give them a good chance of getting to that point? And that's your decision. The national curriculum gives you very limited guidance on that, which in my view is good. It's your call. So when you're thinking about this, you want kids to experience, to make and internalize music. Are we teaching through genres, or are we just teaching about music? That's an interesting one that I've talked a little bit about earlier on. How does theory fit into this? Is this a spiral curriculum? Do we have explicit links between genres or different parts of the curriculum? And how do all these sort of bits of things that I'm just putting up here fit in? It's your call. You decide. And then there's these things here. In the session before, we talked about the voice of students or the voice of pupils. How important is that to you? That their view about what they want to learn about matters. And there's two sides to that coin, because, you know, we do want them to feel that they have a say. On the other hand, we may have ideas that they don't know about, that we can take them into bits of music that they don't know exist. So it's a joint thing, isn't it, between the pupil and the teacher. And you have to make that decision. What about teacher expertise? In your school, you may be an expert in one particular type of music. And for all I've said about genres, does that mean that you focus particularly on that, or do you broaden out? You know, there are all sorts of decisions here. What partnerships do you have? What's the place of technology in this? Which is another big area, which there isn't time to look at this afternoon, although David was talking about it in the session before. You know, technology in music can be an immense force for good. It can really help the learning. And frankly, it can also be quite damaging when it, as it were, does the work for the students and they don't have to think about it. I mean, GarageBand is classic here. GarageBand can be a brilliant thing. But if it's just sort of moving around the deck chairs, you know, you're just sort of moving bits of loops and things around and without really much purpose to it, it's a waste of time. So, you know, and that's just one of many examples. So with technology, you know, there are pluses and minuses, and there are things to think about there too. So all this is rather daunting, I suppose, but it's also rather exciting, because you, as the teacher in your school, have the opportunity now to make these decisions about how you're going to fit this stuff together. I think that's great. I really do. I mean, I think it's a great thing, and I hope you feel excited about that, because it's good. So I suppose the key question that I have posed to people before is this one. You know, what might this musician look like at age 5, 7, 11 or 14? And that's something you have to decide, it seems to me. You make that decision about what this musician is like in your school, and what they know about and what they can do. And then you devise the curriculum that's going to help them to get to that point, and that's your decision. Now, this is the point at which I've got some questions to ask you. It says on the thing that you're going to ask me questions. Actually, I'm going to ask you questions. So this is the point at which I would be, and there's 4 of them, and we've got 15 minutes, which is not bad, actually. We've got time. What I'm going to ask you to do, if you don't mind, is just talk to somebody who's near you now. This is peer partners, you see. I've heard this is quite a good strategy, peer partners. You may have heard of that. But actually, I don't mind if you're talking 2s, 3s, 4s. I don't mind if you move the chairs around and speak in a little group. You choose. It's your call. But what I would like you to do is to talk to at least one other person about the questions that I'm going to pose you. And really, this is just a start. You know, we don't have time to go into depth on this, but these are the sorts of questions which it seems to me are worth thinking about in your school. But you may have other ideas, and that's great too. And if we've got time, we may just hear from one or two people what they've thought of in answering these questions. So the first question is this, and this is a bit countercultural from where we've been. These curriculum components that I'm saying to you must design, do they need to have specific learning objectives or outcomes associated with them? Now, the prevailing culture is that everything has to have about 50 list of this, you will learn this, you would better do this is your will, this is your will. My question is that necessary for these activities that you're going to put in the curriculum? Is this necessary for all of them? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Maybe it is for some of them and not for others, I don't know. It's your call. Can you have 2 minutes with your peer partner just discussing that point? Do these activities need to have a learning objective associated with them? Okay, colleagues, can I come in here? Terribly sorry about this, but we're short of time, so I'm going to have to butt in there. Sorry, colleagues. Can you just stop being so well behaved and doing what I asked you to do and come back? I even had to thank you. It's so you know, we are of course short of time, and these are very short discussions just to get the thinking juices going. This is a very interesting question, this one. And it's one that deserves a lot more time than we were able to give it now. But in the 2 or 3 minutes that you had there, does anybody want to make any quick observation about that particular question? And we may have the man with the mic is coming around. There's somebody here and there's somebody there.
It was slightly more complicated, we thought, than a yes or a no.
Yes.
But we can't. I think the consensus was that learning objectives are impossible all the time, because, for example, if you want to show a classroom or want a classroom to hear Stravinsky's Rites of Spring for the first time, that's a life-changing event for a lot of children, and within music, but you can't really you can't really measure that. So
yes, did you all hear that point? I mean, the point was that I think in a nutshell, the point is that there are some things in music education which are not measurable. So that's rather important, isn't it? Or not easily measurable in a simplistic way. Did you have a point to add as well? Could we just get that across there? Thank you.
I think the difficulty here is that, particularly with practical music making, because it's all about improving technical facility as much as anything else, and the cumulative development of skill, perhaps you don't need lesson objectives for every single lesson, but perhaps you need an idea of, as a minimum, where you want your pupils to be at the end of an extended period of work, and that might be a series of lessons rather than just a one-off. Right. So actually you're looking at that as a minimum, but where they could go from that, the sky's the limit. Right.
So that's another very interesting point, that if you are learning to play an instrument, then there probably is a definable linear or fairly linear set of skills that you need to learn. And I suppose that's why we have grade exams and why grade exams have persisted for so long. So there are aspects of musical learning where it is appropriate to have a kind of objectives-based linear development, but then for other things which are more creative, that's much harder, isn't it? So it seems to me, in my humble view, that some things may need them and some things may not. That's my view, but of course you may have a different view, you know, that's it. But what I can tell you is that when Ofsted calls, we don't mind if you don't have any learning objectives. Can I be very clear about that? Very clear about that. Because I'm absolutely sure, I'm 100% sure, I'm 100% sure about that. Because we don't have a set view of what teaching should look like, or what matters is how good is the learning here. Now, it may be that your learning objective is actually an activity. It's saying we're going to give students this activity to do, and from this, they're likely to develop this, this, and this. But actually, because it's a creative activity, we're not exactly sure what's going to come out of it. And that may be part of your 14 or 11-year-old musician, you know, that they're actually able to do activities like that and come out the other end with something that they have created. Lady here with her hand firmly up.
May I ask, please, is that because you don't inspect the music lesson?
I've inspected at least 2 music lessons this week, I can tell you. And in neither of them did I notice a learning objective, by the way, which was just fine with me. But we are inspecting music, actually, and actually that's likely to happen more commonly as the new framework develops, for reasons that you probably know. And by the way, wasn't it good that the music sector responded so positively to Ofsted's consultation on the new inspection framework? We were the subject that got a special mention in there, so that's good, and that shows that we're on the agenda. So I was quite proud of that. So well done to the sector for achieving that. That was very good. Right, so that's interesting. I don't think that the next one we will actually spend any. What's happened here now? The technology. What did I say about technology earlier on? Hang on. Maybe I've got. Oh dear, this is very bad. What's happening here? Hang on a minute. Maybe this will do it. Done it. Sorted. I'm not going to stop on this one because we've only got 5 minutes left and I want to go on to another one. But this is another question that I've referred to earlier on that you might want to think about this notion of a genre tour, which is quite common, and whether that really is the best way to do it. Not to say we don't talk about genres, as I've explained. I've talked about classical music as one genre at some length already. So not saying that genre doesn't matter, it does. But is that the starting point, or is that something that comes later? That's an interesting point to consider, isn't it? And here's another one that I won't dwell on for now, but this is another interesting point. And again, there isn't an easy answer to this. There are sort of pros and cons here, as we can see, about to what extent does the teacher's own expertise determine the curriculum, or not, as the case may be. Something that as a teacher it's useful to look at, because you in a sense need to explore your own bias and say, well actually, is that bias a good thing because it actually helps the young people to learn because I really know about this, or is it at times actually not giving them something else that they also need? So that's a good thing for a teacher to think about this, is the extent to which their own expertise determines the curriculum. And again, it's not a either or yes or no answer. But this one I think would be quite an interesting discussion just to finish off on. This is our last one. When as a music teacher you have the opportunity to meet with your senior leadership team, what do you think is the really critical agenda item that you would like to raise with them? And actually, could your hub, your ever helpful hub, to go back to where I started, help you with that? So can we go back please for 2 minutes? We've got 4 minutes until the session finishes, so 2 minutes to discuss and then 2 minutes to wrap up at the end. So it will just be 2 minutes. What's the big issue to discuss with your SLT? Say what they think is the key question that they would like to, that would be on top of their agenda when they meet the SLT. There's a lady here who's obviously got a very key and pressing question.
Hello, I think speaking to my colleagues, the overriding feeling we have is that SLT need Ofsted to actually get in touch with them personally, because we are trying to battle. Thank you. We are trying to battle. At the end of the day, our objective is for pupils to leave school with a lifelong love of music, whether it is a performer or a listener. And I think we're being bogged down with assessment and everything else. And I think, please, 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 could Ofsted write personally to SLT and say what you're saying to us? Because I actually think that sometimes SLT just don't want to believe us. They're frightened to leave us to do it the way that we feel we should be doing it. Sorry if I've banged
That's a very good point. You've made a very fair point, and you've expressed it very nicely. So thank you for that. In all truth, this is quite difficult for Ofsted, and I'm not just being defensive here. The reason it's difficult is because, first of all, Ofsted has done that. I mean, in terms of what we've written to schools, we could not have made it clearer that there's no expectation of any kind of assessment system whatsoever, or any kind of teaching system. It can be difficult to sort of overcome the myths, nevertheless, which exist, and that is an endeavour that we're all working on. Be assured that my HMI colleagues understand this very well, and as they discuss things with schools, these points are discussed. I mean, I do assure you that does happen, but nevertheless, these are long-standing sort of myths, stroke barriers, stroke beliefs that take quite a long time to break down. So we do have to continue to do this. The reason why Ofsted isn't even more forthright about saying these things is because Ofsted's position is a little difficult, because Ofsted's view is, and this is quite right, that we're not telling schools you must do it this way or that way or the other way, whether it's teaching or assessment. So if a school really wants to keep levels and sub-levels, it can. It's not that it can't do that. I have never seen that work for music ever, and nor have any of my colleagues. But nevertheless, you know, the school can't. So we can't actually say to a school, "You must not use levels and sub-levels." What we can say is, it doesn't work. But if the school still carries on using it, then, well, you know, what else is there to do? So we have to keep on. This case. But your point is a very fair one, and I hope, although it doesn't completely answer it, I hope I've explained at least why we are where we are. Any other final point? Anybody wants some couple of people just to the last one, just to finish us off in a very nice way? And Dick wants to say something as well. Thank you, because I know the next session's in a few minutes, so we've really got to finish. So just the very last point.
Hello, just a quick question. I was very interested in your asking schools to define what they thought success would look like at 5, 7, 14, 11. And I wanted to ask, what would you say to schools if they wanted to have not one answer to that question, but a huge array of different answers that would allow children to be individually exceptional as musicians, as musical people, all of those things? How would they cope with that? And I also, related to that, if they don't have teaching systems and assessment systems, and you come around and do an assessment and say, this school is really below par, it's not good enough, doesn't that make them very vulnerable?
No more vulnerable than they are now. That's a very, very good. There's a couple of really good questions you've raised there. So thank you. The first one is, what does a young person look like at 11 or 14 or whatever, be flexible? And of course it can. And you know, it is true, and I've said this in other events, so you may have heard me say, but if you have a young person who comes in to your school and they play grade 8 already in 10 instruments, you know, you might have a different expectation for them at age 14 than you would for someone who doesn't. You know, so of course there can be some differentiation within this, but there may be commonality as well. If you wanted to set up a system where you had an individual program for every student or pupil, you absolutely could. I wouldn't criticise that. I would just probably want to offer you a sort of cup of tea or something stronger to make you feel better about it. But you could do that. And of course, those objectives could be differentiated. And it depends rather on how you want to do it, whether you chose to go down that line or not. Now, the question about vulnerability, I don't think that the school's more vulnerable doing this than any other way, because actually schools that have persisted in doing things through the rather rigid mechanisms have very frequently fallen foul of our music inspections because it's not working. So I don't see why a school would be particularly vulnerable doing this. I mean, if it's not doing it very well, well, then it will be vulnerable. But if it's doing this well and teaching the kids well and they're getting good musical experiences, then the school is not going to be vulnerable at all. It's as simple as that. That's all there is to it. I think we've got to finish there. So we really must finish. So, So I just want to finish off by saying it really is your call. People can help you. People can give you advice. People can give national recommendations, all of that. But it's your call. So enjoy it and take it. Thanks for listening. Thank you very much.